make sure they look at Josh.
He was cornered.
Hi, Susan. You haven't seen or heard from you. You said something tragic has happened.
Hey, I'm Dave Cawley. I'm the host of the podcast Cold. It's an investigation into the 2009 disappearance of Susan Powell from West Valley City, Utah. And I'm here with Becky Bruce to talk about the first 3 episodes of the podcast. What are we talking about here, Becky?
Well, I thought for people who aren't familiar with the case that we should probably start off with just some basic overview. So take us back to 2009. Who is Susan Powell? What is this case about?
You got it. So if you're coming into this case with no knowledge of any of it, Susan Powell was a wife and a mother of 2 boys. Her sons named Charlie and Braden, and her husband Josh Powell. She came into the news because on the morning of December 7th of 2009, the boys didn't show up for daycare, and the daycare provider called the emergency contact for the family, which was Josh's sister Jennifer Graves. The Powell family, the Graves family, in turn got a hold of West Valley City Police, asked them to check on the welfare of Susan, Josh, and the boys. They went over to the house, and the whole family was missing. Later that afternoon, Josh returned home with the boys. Susan was not with him, and the question became, where did she go? And that's a question that still lingers today. We started looking into this case several years later after Josh had killed himself and his boys up in Washington State. The police department had reached a point where they were out of active leads in the investigation. They released their case file, and we started, you and I actually both at the time, started going through that and looking for any information that had not been reported before, that might have been overlooked in the investigation, and that was kind of the impetus of the whole podcast.
Yeah, so that's 2013 we're talking about now, and the sheer volume of information that was released at that time was really overwhelming. So what was the spark for you to realize, hey, there might be something in that data?
Yeah. I mean, Becky, I'm sure you remember, you and I were spending our nights reading through hundreds of pages of these police documents, and we came across these references to Josh's interviews with the police on the night that he returned home on December 7th and then again on December 8th. And we here at KSL submitted a public records request to get a hold of those recordings because those had not been released along with the case file. And we put together a story talking about what was in that video, in those recordings of Josh's interviews with the police. And I think for me, it just was kind of this feeling of we were scratching at the very tip of the iceberg. I mean, I hate to use the cliche, but obviously there was much more to this story that we had never heard before. And I just started almost obsessively reading more and more documents in this case file, looking for little tidbits that I didn't know out of my own personal curiosity. And it reached a point where I went to our news director at the time, Cheryl Worsley, and I told her, hey, what about this? What about this, little twist in the investigation? Have you ever heard about that? And she would say no. And I said, well, did you realize that there's video of this? And we can probably go get that. And so we started just pulling those threads one by one and ended up with this volume of material that it seemed like the only proper way to tell that story was to really go in depth and slow down and launch this podcast.
But at the time, you and I were both working full-time,
yeah.
doing what we did as producers for a radio station. So how did you get to a point where you were finally able to really dig in?
Yeah, that was nuts, wasn't it?
Yeah, just a bit.
Both of us. Yeah, I was doing a lot of this at home on my free time. I would come home after a full day of work and would just spend hours reading through emails or police reports, watching video, listening to Josh's audio journals once we obtained those. And I think we realized that the progress was just moving too slowly. And the amount of time it was going to take to put it all together in a form that we could really share with people, if we were going at that pace where I was doing this, one day a month or in my free time, we weren't going to be done until like 2025.
Right.
Right? So it just became necessary, and I think credit to my boss, Cheryl Worsley, for making the case up the chain of her command that they needed to allocate the resources to allow me to work on it full time.
And that started when? Just this year?
No, so I mean, we were working on this kind of at a snail's pace going back to about 2016 timeframe. I started working on this as my full-time job technically in February, but we really accelerated the production last fall.
Sure.
Yeah.
So walk me through how you found from episode 1, Catherine.
Yeah, right. So Josh Powell's ex-girlfriend. That was kind of crazy. There was a document that came out from Washington State, and it included all of the case file from Josh's boys being involved with the child welfare agency up there. They were taken out of the home after Josh's dad was arrested, and Josh was trying to get them back, and he had to go to the court and basically say, what do I have to do to get my kids back? And the court told him, well, you are going to have to submit to this parenting evaluation. Go see a psychologist and go through all these tests. And he told the psychologist as part of that interview that he had a girlfriend before he had married his wife. Her name was Catherine. They dated for about 16 months. And so I had this reference in this document to this woman named Catherine, and I knew that they'd probably dated somewhere in, late 90s based on the fact that Josh and Susan met in 2000 and were married in early 2001. Then we realized that there were journals that Josh had kept that the police obtained from his computers that had never been made public. And we requested those from the West Valley City Police Department, started going through thousands of documents off of his computers, and I was keeping an eye out for any additional reference to Catherine, this woman. And so it was a bit of kind of, connecting the dots between that original reference to some very vague mentions of her in emails that Josh was sending to his friends or that he was writing in his journal. But it was made more difficult by the fact that he had gone back with whiteout and blotted her name out because he was so mad that she had dumped him. So ultimately it came down to finding Catherine a full reference to her first and last name, and then searching that against the Facebook group, the Friends and Family of Susan Powell Facebook group, where a lot of people over the years have kind of followed the case, and recognizing that she had posted in there early in 2010 about it. And I reached out to her on Facebook, and that was how that all came around.
So just a simple Facebook message to a stranger.
Yeah. Yeah, which is weird, right? Because here I come out of the blue, and I basically introduce myself saying, hey, I'm this investigative reporter. I know you dated Josh Powell, and I want to talk to you about it.
How did she react to that?
I expected to not hear a word. I thought that it would just be radio silence, and I might have to go knock on a door or something like that. To her credit, she called me within 30 minutes, and our original conversation, as I remember it, was basically, I've got nothing to lose, and I'm surprised that you found me, but let's talk about it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So we do have some folks listening on Facebook and watching on Facebook, and one of the questions that's come in is one that I get a lot as I help monitor our social media accounts here, and that is, why no arrests?
Yeah.
It's a big question.
And this is something that obviously is going to play out over the whole course of the podcast. We know that Josh was never arrested in spite of a lot of circumstantial evidence. I've had numerous conversations with the lead detective in the case. I'm aware of a lot of the information that has come out through the police documents. And I think reasonable people can look at what they had and say, I would have arrested Josh. The reason that you're going to hear that they didn't arrest Josh, I think, in the podcast is that they didn't have strong enough physical evidence. So
Lots of circumstantial.
All of this circumstantial evidence, and I think most people looking at the case from the outside, even from day one, went, wow, this guy sure looks guilty. But to this day, the police can't tell you how they think Susan died, or where she is, how Josh did whatever he did. So if you're going to go into a courtroom and try to convince a jury beyond the standard of a reasonable doubt, that's a tough sell, unless you can say specifically, here's what we believe happened, here's how we support that. If all it is wow, this thing looks fishy, a defense attorney is going to take that and turn on his head and say, but what about this or what about that?
Right.
So I think the judgment call among the police and the prosecutors in the case was that they didn't feel like they had what they needed. And again, that's
And we should
their
probably
judgment.
make the distinction for folks that are following along that probable cause is a standard for arrest.
Right.
Reasonable doubt is at trial. So they might have had enough evidence to arrest, but they probably didn't feel like they had anything to keep him there.
So, and it again, it goes back to this question of, you've got this evidence. Do you have probable cause? Well, certainly, because they're using that probable cause to obtain search warrants and subpoenas. But if you're going to put somebody in jail, take their freedom away, in the state of Utah, you have basically 3 days to file charges on somebody who has been put in jail or let them go. And if you let them go, well, now what happens? So usually what you'll see happen is someone gets arrested, and then within that 3-day period of time, they're charged and they get into the justice system. In this case, I think they felt that time was on their side, and that as long as they had their eyes on Josh, they would be able to just kind of work at the case until they were ready to make the arrest. And of course, that ended up resulting in a very tragic situation up in Washington.
We had another question come in on Facebook just now about whether the family is okay with what you're doing.
Which family?
Well, I'm assuming they meant Powell's, but or Cox's rather,
yeah.
Susan's family,
Yeah.
but I don't know.
So I've talked to Susan's dad, Chuck Cox, on several occasions. I've visited his home a couple of times. I think what it boils down to for most of Susan's friends and her family is that anything that can lead to closure in the sense of finding where she is or what happened to her, they support. And more than that, recognizing that there are themes that come out from Susan's story that might help other people. And Chuck Cox specifically told me that. He said, the only reason to keep doing this, to keep telling this story, is to help other people at this point. So they're aware of it. Susan had 3 sisters, one of whom, Mary, I referenced in the first episode because Josh had romantic interest in her. I reached out to her a number of times, and she did not respond. And we respect that. These are people who have their own lives, their own privacy, and it's got to be difficult to constantly see this story dredged up. And so our goal is not to harm anybody in any way.
What did you learn just about how investigations work in missing persons cases? Did you wind up kind of learning a lot about the process?
Yeah, a lot. I mean, I'm still learning today, right? We're gathering information even as we release these episodes that helps me better understand what was happening in the criminal investigation. I continue to have conversation with people who were, on the police side of things, learning how they operate. And there are a number of tactics that they used in this investigation, and we'll get into it later in the podcast, that are very non-traditional. These are not things that you see happen in a typical criminal investigation. You see involvement of federal agencies. I think a lot of people don't realize the role that the FBI and DEA and the U.S. Marshals ended up having in this investigation. The fact that it crossed state bounds, and so you had a lot of active tracking going on as Josh is moving back and forth between Utah and Washington. And so anyone, I think, who subscribes to the podcast and listens along is going to really see kind of behind the curtain how that stuff all works.
In those first couple of episodes, particularly episode 2, we learned some really dark stuff. And one of our viewers is asking, how has this affected you personally?
It's a good question. Steve Powell was not a nice person. And this video right here basically involves him detailing what I believe was a sexual assault against his own daughter-in-law. And during this video, he disrobes, and we were very selective in the pieces of this video that we would show because we didn't want to allow him to victimize Susan. But in order to make that decision, I had to watch the whole thing.
Right.
And likewise with his journals.
They're pretty explicit.
They're very explicit, and they go to, they go to a very dark place. And so, yeah, it's been hard for me. But more than that, every time I think about that, I think about the detectives who were working this investigation who found all that, and they likewise had to go through all of that. I've seen a small piece of what they ended up actually having to review. So, yeah, it's not nice stuff, and it does take a toll on you.
Yeah. Was there anything that was found in the van, is something that somebody else is asking us.
Josh's minivan, yeah. This will come up next week when we get into episode 4. Josh comes back off the Pony Express Trail, and before he can even get in his driveway, he's met by Detective Ellis Maxwell, who ends up being the lead investigator in this case. And Ellis has Josh drive right over to the West Side Precinct Station for the West Valley City Police Department. They conduct an interview, and at the end of that, Ellis tells Josh, hey, we want to search your van. And so they go out and they start looking through the van, so they find all of his camping supplies. He brought some interesting stuff with him on that camping trip. He had his generator to power some small space heaters, but he had like plastic sleds in there, some tarps that had obviously, one was like clean, one was dirty, had been used, been laid out. Blankets for the boys and things, but the biggest thing that they found in the van the night that Josh came home was Susan's cell phone, which was powered off, and they later discovered the SIM card had been taken out.
So back up just a second. Episode 3, we learned that Susan's parents have actually been paying for her to have a cell phone.
Right.
So did Josh know she had the cell phone?
He did. Originally, Josh didn't know about it. Susan's parents were afraid that, with her not having a cell phone, if she ever had to leave the house, take the boys and get out of a dangerous situation, that she needed a way to be able to call for help. So they bought her this cell phone because Josh was not willing to pay for his wife to have a cell phone. And then when Josh learned that she had it, he was okay with it because, great, I don't have to pay for you to have this cell phone. So he was aware of it at the time that she disappeared. The question was, why did he have it with him? And boy, doesn't that sound like evidence, and we'll explain. In fact, I will ask that question directly of the detective in episode 4, why that wasn't enough.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
All right. So has anything come to light during the making of the podcast that has churned up new investigations or spurred new tips for police?
For police, I can't speak for them. I can tell you that for ourselves, yes. After the release of episode 1, once it was clear what we were working on, several people have come forward and either brought to my attention information that was new to me or that hadn't been previously reported that I was aware of. Some of that we're still in the process right now of attempting to verify. And if we can, certainly that information, if it's relevant to the case, will be handed over to the police.
How can people reach out to you if they think they can help?
Right. So we're very active right now on obviously Facebook. So off of the Cold Facebook page, we're on Twitter and Instagram at the Cold Podcast for both of those. Anyone can message us directly through there. I'm myself on Twitter and Facebook as well. You can also email me directly. We have a cold@ksl.com email address that gets right to our team.
Okay. Talk to me a little bit about what you've learned about abuse and domestic violence through the course of this case, because one thing that people have reached out to us and said is, abuse isn't always physical.
Yeah. Becky, it's been overwhelming. The number of people who have either shared with me or commented on posts about their experiences with domestic abuse, or thanking us because they feel like the story that is being told has the potential of helping someone or has helped someone. That was a theme that we identified very early on in our investigation, that what happened to Susan was abuse, even though it didn't outwardly look like it to a lot of people because there wasn't physical hitting going on. But there was a lot of manipulation and control. And I continue to have conversations with domestic violence advocates about things that we're learning in this case and identifying some of those behaviors. And wherever possible, I hope to reincorporate those into the podcast so that people who are listening, when they hear something, it's not just telling the story for the story's sake, but it's also recognizing that this abuse takes many different forms, and that no one should be trapped in that kind of a relationship.
What kinds of warning signs did you identify as you were looking at Susan's story?
Yeah, Josh and Susan specifically, where do you begin with all the red flags that were there? And this goes way back to Josh dating women before he met Susan. It's the control of her finances. He very early on, before they're even married in their dating life, is having her buy things for him. It's not that she's gifting it, he's asking her to buy things for him. Later on in their marriage, he is becoming so obsessive about the finances that he's criticizing her for spending a few cents more, to buy one brand versus another. And Susan ends up having to make a decision: do I eat or do I feed my boys? Which Chuck Cox told me, that is a form of physical abuse. You might not recognize it because it's not hitting, but if you're starving yourself in order to feed your children because your husband won't allow you to spend your own money that you're earning on food for your family, yeah, it's a form of abuse. The control that Josh exhibited over contact outside of him and his immediate family, wanting to make sure that he knows who she's talking to, isolating her from her family, her siblings, not wanting her to spend time with friends and coworkers, which Susan, shortly before she disappeared in 2009, starts basically saying, I'm going to do what I want. I'm going to go out and have a girls' night. And he didn't like that. So those are a few things that stood out to me. Yeah.
We had another question come in about why people like Catherine maybe didn't come forward sooner.
Yeah. That's a great question. Catherine was afraid, and I think you can understand where she was at. I try to put myself in her shoes a little bit and understand that here's a woman who went through an abusive relationship, and she managed to escape it, and her way of dealing with it was essentially to bury it and just say, I'm not thinking about this, I'm not dealing with it, I'm moving to another state, I'm married, I have my own family, now it's gone. Then Josh shows up on the TV news when Susan disappears, and she goes into kind of a depressive state, just thinking, oh my gosh, how could this possibly be? Feeling like, whatever happened to Susan, she was probably already dead, just based on what she knew of Josh. And I think we saw publicly the relationship between Josh and his dad, and the way they very actively attacked Susan's family after she disappeared, tried to smear Susan's friends using a website and things like that. And Catherine, for her own safety and sanity, basically said, I can't be involved in any of this. Now, as for not telling the police, she felt like nothing that she could say to them would tell them something they didn't already know. She didn't have any information on what specifically had happened to Susan. I think it's fair in retrospect to ask, would maybe it have helped them to understand better who Josh was? But they also had a pretty good sense of who Josh was pretty quick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have another question from a viewer on Facebook wanting to know, have you talked to the judge who made the decision to allow the kids to see Josh?
I have not. Washington State, after the boys died, the law in Washington State mandates that when you have an in-custody death, so even though the boys were staying with the Coxes, they were considered basically to be under state protection at that time. The law up there requires that all of the casework be released, made public, so that it can be reviewed. There's a board of inquiry that goes through and looks at all of that. So all of the judges' decisions were reviewed in that case. There's currently ongoing litigation between the Cox family and the state of Washington. It's a wrongful death lawsuit, and because of that, basically no one that was involved in that process is going to talk about it.
Was Josh ever diagnosed with any form of a mental illness that we know of?
Mental illness, so when he went through the parenting evaluation in Washington State, the psychologist who interviewed him and performed the tests, so it's a whole battery of tests that they perform, his report concluded that Josh showed signs of narcissism, And so that's a personality disorder. It's not necessarily a mental illness, but I certainly think that shown pretty brightly in his writings, going way back into his childhood, this kind of narcissistic attitude. And ultimately the review of his parenting capacity wasn't necessarily to diagnose him with anything. There was a follow-up examination that he was supposed to go through called a psychosexual evaluation that would have been much more in depth, but he killed himself before that could be completed.
One thing we've heard a lot from some of the folks on our social media accounts since episode 2 was published was surprise at how much Stephen Powell and then Josh Powell both liked to record themselves.
Yeah.
Any idea does that go back to the narcissism?
Yeah, I don't know. And I go back and forth on that, because if you look at Steve Powell's journaling, I mean, it is extensive. Hundreds and hundreds of pages. And he's not writing usually about anything other than Susan or whoever he's, temporarily fixated on aside from Susan. That journaling was very unusual, but then you add in the video component, and you got to put yourself back in 2002, 2003 timeframe when he's shooting a lot of these videos. This is predating smartphones with video cameras, where we're constantly shooting selfie video and posting Instagram stories and things. So I think it was even more abnormal at the time. Josh's audio journals, he, I think, did a lot of that because he didn't want to write a journal the way his dad did. He wanted to speak it into this audio recorder and then take that digital file, plug it into software that would transcribe it for him. But then, he's talking about things that most people aren't going to write in their journal. I mean, what are you going to write in your journal? You're going to talk about how you felt about certain things, maybe important events in your life, and he would talk about just inane, boring things. I went here, I bought this, I ate Del Taco for dinner, and then I drove to this place, right? And it's like this recounting of his life. So, yeah, I mean, if he's not recording that for himself, who is the audience here?
A case in point would be the after their wedding. He's
right.
detailing the drive to the hotel.
Yeah, that one stood out to me. And I hope it did to you too, that I imagine being married and on your wedding night driving to your honeymoon location with your new bride, and how you must, certainly you would feel something, you would hope. But all Josh can do is talk about playing with his camera and, getting this shot, getting that shot. Never in that recording did he say anything about how much he loved Susan, how happy he was to be married to her, how he looked forward to their life together. And the tone of his voice is just flat and just dull. And it breaks my heart for Susan.
We've had a lot of people write in and comment on the tone of Josh's voice in some of those recordings. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I've seen those comments. A lot of people are comparing him to Warren Jeffs, who, if people are not familiar with Warren Jeffs, he is the imprisoned leader of a polygamist group, and Warren Jeffs delivered speeches to his followers that were very similar in tone. It's tough to know. Without being in the room with Josh when he's recording those, I don't know if he's keeping his voice down because he doesn't want to be overheard, or but everybody who knew him later in life describes him as being very over the top. He was an in-your-face kind of speaker. He would talk at the top of his voice, get in your face, he's pushing his opinions, and he will talk and talk and talk nonstop for hours on end. And when you listen to these audio recordings of him, it's a very different tone. So, I'm not sure how much of that was an affectation that he was just putting on, or how much of that was drawn out of his personality at the time.
We have another question now about Susan's faith in particular, and the episode 3 was called Faith and Finances, whether her faith and her church might have been a reason that she stayed.
Yes, it was a huge part of why she stayed. So if we go back to 2008, Susan is at her wit's end. her marriage is completely falling apart. She's thinking about getting a divorce. She's secretly talking to attorneys, seeing what would be required. She's documenting her assets. She's putting $500 in a safe, in U.S. savings bond in a safe deposit box, so that if she ever needs them, she can grab, her birth certificate, her boys' birth certificates, and some money to get out of town. But she feels like, because this is an eternal marriage, which is part of the belief system of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is that Latter-day Saints who are married in the temple and sealed are sealed together beyond their death through eternity, that Josh is her eternal companion, and that she has a responsibility to help him basically come back from the brink. She wants him to return to the man that she married, who was an active churchgoer. In mid-November of 2008, she went to a temple and she spent the whole day there, basically praying for guidance on what she should do. And she came away from that experience feeling like she needed to stay. And so she had a lot of friends who were telling her to leave, were trying to help her, give her advice on how to divorce, how to safely hide from Josh if that was necessary. But she made that decision that she was going to stick with it.
And we don't have Susan's voice much of the time in the same way that we do Josh's. There's a little snippets here, primarily thanks to Steve.
Yeah, unfortunately.
But so as a result, in the podcast, a lot of times instead of hearing Susan's actual voice, we're hearing the voice of actually somebody who works here.
Yeah.
So how did you make that decision, and what was that like to try and give Susan a voice when she didn't really have one?
Yeah. So let me rewind a little bit on that. The police, when they were serving their search warrants and subpoenas, they went after Susan's Facebook account, her Hotmail account, and her work email. And they obtained what basically, if you printed it all out, would be thousands and thousands of pages of her personal communication. They went through and redacted, so they took out the names of the people she was talking to so that they weren't putting out personal information. But in reading through all of those, I certainly felt like I got to know Susan in a way that nobody else who wasn't privy to some of those conversations would. A more intimate portrait of her, the way maybe her friends and family knew her. And I wanted to bring that to the podcast, but having me read those emails isn't going to work, right? I don't have the ability to kind of embody Susan that way. So yes, we asked Kristen Sorensen, one of our coworkers here, to basically sit down and put herself kind of in the mind of Susan and to read these to provide a voice. And I hope that people who listen to the podcast, even though we know it's not Susan's actual voice, that approach will help them feel like they are getting to know her using her own words.
Was it strange for you as a journalist to have to make that call, to have somebody sort of dramatize something that, normally we deal in facts?
Yeah. I mean, we typically wouldn't put that on the radio, right, on KSL, because it is a dramatization. It's not somebody actually saying the thing. But it's an audio storytelling, approach here with the podcast, and certainly our story is rooted in the journalism, but we have to be able to bring the listener into the story. And so, to me, it made sense pretty much from the get-go to do it that way.
What else do you feel like you learned about Susan through being able to look at her handwriting and her thoughts and feelings in that way?
She was incredibly devoted to her marriage, to her religion, to her sons, to her friends. Susan was a bit of a flirt, and even her friends will tell you that she oftentimes didn't realize maybe how she came off to other people. She had a tendency to overshare. So, and I think this got her in a little trouble at work sometimes, that she would tell coworkers things that maybe would make someone a little uncomfortable. But that also helped her make friends, right? Because that kind of sense of intimacy in the things that she was willing to tell people helped them, those who were interested in being friends with her, I think, feel very close to her. And so a number of people who came forward to the police, or that I've even spoken with through the course of this, would say, well, Susan told me this thing, and she kind of told it to me in confidence. I don't know if I should share it. And I would kind of secretly sit back and laugh, because I'm thinking, I heard this from 5 other people already, because she told everybody. So that's definitely one thing that stuck out.
Yeah. How did you sell this idea to KSL, and did you or they think it would be as big as it's been?
I'll answer the second half of that question first. I had no idea how this was going to be received. I didn't know if 5 people would listen to it, 2 of those being my parents, right? It's a story that I've long been passionate about, and so I don't think we anticipated that it would resonate as strongly as it has. I'm grateful for it. I think KSL is grateful for it, because we collectively believe that it can do some good. In terms of making the pitch, let me tell you how that kind of came about. Earlier in the Facebook Live, we were talking about getting the case file and digging into some of those details. Well, I went to a conference several years ago for investigative journalists, and I was sitting down listening to other journalists from across the country talking about the cool stories that they had done, and they're kind of delving into podcasting. And as a radio journalist, I thought to myself, I already have the tools and the know-how to do an audio story, but we here at KSL have not taken on that challenge of doing a long-form investigative podcast. And if there's one case that I can think of that would warrant it, it would be the Powell case. So I came back from that conference and sat down with my boss and basically said, here's what I think we should do. Let's do the Powell podcast. And the response that I received was, it's a fantastic idea, we should totally do it. How in the world are we going to do that while you're still working your full-time job? So it took some time to figure that out. But once I think the vision was there, everybody bought in.
It gets a little bit heartbreaking, at least it was for me, in episode 3, especially towards the end of the audio, when we are hearing the dramatized version of Susan's journaling and notes to friends, talking about how much she wanted another child. And then those notes about she wasn't feeling that well.
Yeah.
What was going on? Do we know that yet?
No. Unfortunately, we probably will never know. So in episode 3, you hear, that month basically before Susan disappears, she goes through this extended period of feeling not well. And I think someone listening to the podcast can probably draw the conclusion that, man, it sure sounds like she's either A, pregnant, or B, being possibly poisoned. And so she was going to the doctor, having blood tests to see if she was pregnant. She wanted desperately to have a daughter, and more than that, to have twins. And she knew the marriage wasn't good, and she kept justifying to herself, to her family, to her friends that, maybe she stays in the marriage long enough to get the children that she wants, and then she'll divorce Josh. I didn't see necessarily that she believed having kids would help the marriage, but that.
But she wanted them.
But she wanted them. She felt like, and I think it goes back to her faith, feeling that there was a daughter out there that she was supposed to have. So there were several times through 2009 where she believed she might have become pregnant. Her opportunities were very slim because Josh was largely withholding physical contact with Susan, and so she usually had a pretty good idea if there was opportunity. She had multiple blood tests in that November 2009 timeframe that came up negative for pregnancy. But it's not clear that she ever followed up on the advice of her friends to maybe see if there was something else in her blood work that was suspicious. And West Valley Police did go back to try to see if those blood samples were still available after she disappeared. This is a little known fact, but they had already been discarded.
Yeah, I would imagine your average doctor's office can't hang on to that stuff forever unless they immediately know there's a reason to.
Yeah. I mean, I think I don't remember the exact retention policy off the top of my head, but it was, you know, it was a month or so later, month or 6 weeks later, that the police were going back looking, and of course the blood sample was not there.
How cooperative was West Valley City with you as you were making some of these public records requests?
It's been an ongoing process. You know, they're a busy police agency. We sat down with them early on and explained what we wanted to do and warned them that it was going to be a long process and we were going to be asking for a lot of stuff. Part of the challenge has been that most of the investigators who were very actively involved have since moved on from the agency. So some of the folks who are at the police department now don't have the same knowledge of the case. They don't know where to find certain documents or pieces of evidence that we've asked for. And basically they would have to devote a lot of time to go back and find some things. So we negotiated back and forth about what our priorities were. They were not comfortable handing us everything that we asked for. There are a few things that I'm still a little disappointed that I don't have that I think would be good to share with people, but legally they're prohibited from providing us. So I would say they've been cooperative, though we don't always see eye to eye.
Sure. What about in Washington State? I think you've been working with Pierce County's Sheriff's Office there?
Yeah, Pierce County's been great. Detective Sergeant Gary Sanders up there, he and I worked for more than a year to try to find specific Steve Powell videos that actually ended up being in West Valley the whole time. There was some misunderstanding between West Valley and Pierce County up in Washington about who had what. And so, yeah, they've been good. They have a little different approach than West Valley. You know, it was not their case, even though so much of this story happens in their kind of jurisdiction. They were not the lead investigators on Susan's case, and they took a back seat to West Valley for a lot of that. So as long as they have the go-ahead for their evidence to share it, they're willing to do that. And then where West Valley might have concerns with something, you know, I leave it to them to figure out between them what they'll release.
What can you tell me about next week?
Spoilers! I'm actually really excited for episode 4. In episode 4, we slow the pace way, way down and focus entirely on the day that Susan disappeared. Almost a minute-by-minute recounting of what happened that day, so you can see exactly how it plays out. You also get to meet Detective Ellis Maxwell, who is the lead investigator through the end of his career. He retired after this case went cold, and he has been very candid. He and I have been speaking for more than a year and a half. And I think a lot of people will be surprised to hear how thoughtful he is, how I believe diligent he was on this case, and some of the insight that he's going to share about his interactions with Josh, I think will really raise a lot of eyebrows next week.
He having retired, I think, probably goes back to what you were just saying about the trouble in finding some of that information.
Yeah, yeah. And so, you know, it's been useful to have somebody like Ellis, who is basically a textbook of the case. I mean, he lived this thing for 3 years. Now, right or wrong, you know, I think people who listen to the podcast will be able to decide whether or not they think he did a good job. I leave that up to them. But certainly giving him the opportunity to explain why he made the decisions that he did is useful. And along the way, if I've had questions about where to find things, you know, whether or not a certain piece of evidence was here or in Washington, he's been a fantastic resource and very helpful on that.
We talked about Josh's journals a little bit. We were talking about the audio specifically,
Yeah.
but a lot of his journals were just scraps of paper.
Yeah.
How do you organize something that massive?
Man, you don't. And just to give people kind of an idea of what we've had to deal with the files that we retrieved from West Valley off of Josh's computers, the software that they use to pull those off of Josh's computer doesn't retain any kind of metadata. So you don't have any information about file name, when it was created, to help organize it. All I get is a folder full of documents with generic number tags. And so I have to go through one by one and basically build an index. So that's what I did from home, was arrow down, open this one, what is this? Type a note about it, arrow down, next one, type a note about it. And so just the process of organizing all of that information took a very long time. And then you have to start looking at, okay, this is Josh's journal. Well, really what it is it's like the back of a receipt that he got somewhere someday, and he wrote quickly the date, and I hung out with so-and-so, we went to this place, I spent $5 on this, and then he throws that in a drawer or a folder, and then at some time later it gets scanned into his computer. So there's no organization to any of this information. We basically had to go back and build that timeline ourselves off of just a giant haystack of files.
And scanning it in?
Yeah. He made Susan do a lot of that. And she makes reference to this in some of her writings through the years, that Josh would get mad because she wasn't staying on top of her scanning, which was supposed to be one of her tasks at home, in addition to taking care of the kids, making the meals, plus working a full-time job.
We have somebody asking a question that I'm almost a little nervous to ask you because I know how busy you are just doing the podcast. Is there a book in the future?
Podcast first.
Yeah.
This was part of the conversation that I had with my managers when we originally came up with the idea. Because of the amount of audio that we knew was there, these recordings and things, it made sense to focus on telling the story through the podcast. I'm committed to seeing that process through before I decide what I do next. If at some point it makes sense to write a book, I'm not opposed to that, but I also know that there are several other good books out there telling this story from different perspectives. Josh's sister, Jennifer Graves, wrote a book, which I've read, called A Light in Dark Places, that if people are interested in hearing more from her, I suggest they read. Detective Maxwell, who I said, we're going to meet next week in episode 4, he is currently himself working on a book, and I know he's withheld things from me to save a few nuggets for his book as well. So I personally am looking forward to reading that one.
Yeah, that would be fascinating.
Yeah.
Another question we get a lot, and I also, Insider Baseball, I know the answer to this, but I'm going to let you say it. Why can't we release more often than once a week?
Yeah, that's the most asked question about this whole thing. The reason we can't release more than one a week is because I literally am working 7 days a week right now just trying to stay in front of this. We released when we did for a number of different reasons. I don't have everything done. And like I've said numerous times, I'm still learning things. So I'm both investigating this story and putting together what I know into next week's episode. I'm not as far ahead of it as I would like to be. It would be great to be able to say we had everything done and we're just dropping it on you and binge away, friends, because I'm certainly that type of a listener. But the honest answer is I'm still doing it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, we talked about scanning in. I mean, how many thousands of pieces of paper did you have to index? Do you even know?
No, I mean, I think we came up with a rough guess just based on some of the larger documents that I know that we went through, files, that it's upwards of, well, it's beyond 30,000 pages reviewed. Just to give you an idea, the number of documents I received from West Valley for what I consider to be a fairly narrow request of Josh's files was about 3,500. So I indexed all of those. But beyond even that, you got to remember that one file could be 2 hours of audio. And so I have to listen to that and record the time code of everything that's being said so that if we need to pull a piece out of this later, we can come back and know where that is. So yeah, number of files is large. Actual hours of time spent is also very large.
Do you think you know what happened to Susan?
I have my own personal theory, but it shifts as I learn different things, and it's changed over the course of time. I thought pretty clearly when I started this process that there was a lot of searching going on out in the West Desert. There's a lot of reason to believe that Susan might have ended up out there. My personal belief anymore is that she's not. I don't think she is. There are reasons for that, and I think reasonable people could disagree. I know on the law enforcement side, police, there's disagreement among the detectives who worked on this case about what they think happened to her. So I think it's a little premature to maybe go into what I think happened, but we'll get there. We'll get there.
All right. I think that pretty much covers it here. Is there anything that you would like to add before we wrap this one up? Full disclosure, we are going to try and make this a regular thing.
Yeah, we'd like to.
So as more episodes roll out, we'll try and make it, I don't think it's going to be exactly weekly, but as close to that as we can. We'll try and come back and answer more questions about some of the future episodes that we can't answer now because we don't want to spoil you, and Dave's still doing the work. But what else have you got?
Yeah, I honestly would just say thank you to everybody who has listened so far. Thank you to everyone who sent us a message, sent me a message explaining how Susan's story has impacted them, how friends or family members have seen situations of domestic abuse in Susan's case, recognized familiar patterns in their own life, and started the process of making a change. That's been huge, and that keeps me going. So thank you very much for that. Keep listening. Please tell your friends. We're very excited to get this in front of as many people as possible. And I'm just so grateful for everybody that's listened so far.
Hit us up at thecoldpodcast.com. You'll also find Apple Podcasts, Google, Stitcher, Spotify, all the places.
All the
places.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening.